Welcome to Zoom in, Zoom out, your in-depth look at how news from Taiwan is impacting the world. I'm Leslie Liao. China is carrying out unannounced drills around Taiwan, with Taiwan's military reporting at least 68 PLA aircrafts and 10 naval ships spotted in a single day. In response, the United States recently pledged $320 million in military support for Taiwan, adding to the annual $2 billion military assistance grant the U.S. authorized last year. But why do China's military activities impact U.S. and global interests? To answer this, I spoke to David Sachs in New York City. David is a fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. We began our interview by taking a look at the military landscape in the Taiwan Strait before zooming in on U.S. interests in Taiwan.
So my own view here is actually that, the United States talks about respecting the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, but there is one party right now, and that is China, the People's Republic of China, that is not satisfied with the status quo. And we can see that in terms of the escalation of activity through Taiwan's air defense identification zone, both in terms of how often it is occurring and the types of flights and aircraft used in Taiwan's ADIZ. We can see that in erasing the median line in the Taiwan Strait. Economic sanctions on Taiwanese companies, as well as pressure on Taiwanese companies operating in the PRC. So I don't think that the status quo is static, and I don't think that all three parties have agreement that the status quo is in their interests and should be something that they respect. So I think we have to come to terms with the fact that China right now is not satisfied with the status quo and sees it as both in their interest and something that's achievable to change the status quo.
You just said the PLA has been escalating things like erasing the median line. If they want to express more discontent, how else might they push that envelope?
What I worry about right now would be a deliberate attempt by the PLA to essentially assert its sovereignty over Taiwan by violating Taiwan's territorial airspace or its territorial waters. And so the PLA has thus far, it has violated Taiwan's self-declared air defense identification zone, but hasn't entered Taiwan's territorial airspace. It hasn't come within 24 nautical miles of Taiwan's shores. But I fear that the next step for the PLA, or for China more generally, will be to say, well, listen, Taiwan is a part of China. We administer its waters and airspace, and therefore the PLA is going to fly and sail wherever it wants and stop us.
And let's say that they do test that bottom line. Taiwan's defense ministry has already said, they will not allow that to happen. Say it does happen. This is like a game of chicken.
Well, I think that then we're in uncharted territory. I mean, if you are a political or military leader in Taiwan, you cannot let China violate your, sovereign waters or airspace, and you have to find a way to respond. And that's why I think that would be such a dangerous scenario. I don't think that it's fated that that's where we're heading. I don't think it's inevitable, but I do fear, when the PLA does things like saying it has the right to board and search ships after President Tsai meets with Speaker McCarthy. That's sending a signal that it's looking to employ its lawfare playbook to change the status quo.
In your experience following developments in Asia, how significant of a factor is China's modernization to altering the security environment in the region?
Well, the PLA is in the midst of, I think, an unprecedented modernization and military buildup. And a lot of it, you could say, well, China's military modernization has been focused above all on preparing for a Taiwan contingency and preventing the United States from coming to Taiwan's defense through its anti-access area denial program. So this represents a threat, I think, not just to Taiwan and the United States, but to U.S. allies and partners in the region. And it's something that we need to take very seriously and prioritize. The U.S. National Defense Strategy has called China its pacing challenge, meaning that everything should be devoted within the Department of Defense towards countering that and preparing for those contingencies. And a senior defense official went further and said that China is the pacing challenge and Taiwan is the pacing scenario, being even clearer about where we should be focused. And I think that right now, the issue as I see it is there is a bit of a say-do gap. We're saying all the right things in terms of prioritizing China, prioritizing preparing for potential contingencies in the Taiwan Strait, but there is a gap between, are we actually resourcing this? Are we really focused on this above all else? And to me, there are some trade-offs that have to be made, and there are some things that we're not seeing yet out of the Department of Defense that we need to be seeing if they're serious about viewing this as, the pacing challenge.
That was David Sachs on military developments in China and the US's corresponding defense strategy. But how does the US justify spending so much on defense so far from its own borders? Well, David recently wrote an article titled "Why Taiwan is Important to the United States." And the answer is so much more than semiconductors. For the next part of our interview, we zoom in on how Taiwan impacts the US.
I think it's important to have this conversation in the United States because, frankly, a lot of Americans couldn't find Taiwan on a map and don't necessarily understand the breadth of our relationship with Taiwan, the unique commitments we have to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act, as well as Taiwan's importance. I think that there's the undeniable factor, which you cannot change either, which is Taiwan's location at the heart of the first island chain. If China were to use aggression or force against Taiwan, it would have major repercussions for US treaty allies, above all Japan and the Philippines. China would also be able to project military power far beyond the first island chain much more easily, as well as, again, threaten our treaty allies that we have a commitment to defend. The second thing that I would also say is, by many measures, Taiwan is the freest society in Asia. It is a thriving democracy, and the United States has an interest, in my view, in supporting those democracies, especially those under threat from authoritarian regimes. I think Taiwan, frankly, sets an example for others in Asia, one worth emulating and following, and the United States should support that. I think that a lot of this conversation has, frankly, changed in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We now see that authoritarian countries do use force to unilaterally change borders, which is the fundamental tenet of international order, that countries do not do that. And so I think if China were to use force against Taiwan in an attempt to change borders, it would drastically undermine that pillar of international order, and that would have ripple effects throughout the world. And you mentioned semiconductors. Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, around 70% of all semiconductors. This powers everything from our phones to our computers to, any household appliances and our cars that we drive every day. So, if there was aggression in the Taiwan Strait, whether that be a blockade or an invasion or anything else that paralyzes the semiconductor industry, it would absolutely lead to a global depression, shave trillions of dollars off global output, and there's no way around that.
Let's go back out to the Indo-Pacific. What might the U.S. be able to do to deter China from acting on Taiwan militarily?
There's a lot more that the United States military can do unilaterally in terms of our own force posture in the region, showing China that we have the ability to come to Taiwan's defense and defeat PRC aggression. So there's more that we can do by ourselves. There's more we can do with Taiwan. I think that using presidential drawdown authority to provide Taiwan weapons in a timely manner that it needs to bolster deterrence, I think that's another good sign. I hope we do more of that. There's also, I think, a lot more that we can do with our allies and partners in the region. In my view, our number one asymmetric advantage vis-a-vis China is our allies and partners, from Japan to the Philippines to South Korea and Australia. In my view, AUKUS, if everything goes kind of according to plan, and it is very ambitious and has a long time horizon ahead of it, but if everything goes according to plan and Australia gets a submarine capability, that would increase deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. I think that would be a great development.
We've seen delayed weapons deliveries from the US to Taiwan. How does this impact the situation in the Strait?
Well, of course, it's a negative development. I think what we've found from the war in Ukraine is that the U.S. defense industrial base is stretched, that it was working off of essentially a Cold War peace dividend. But there needs to be a lot more done right now in terms of the U.S. defense industrial base to ensure that we have enough for what the U.S. military needs above all, as well as what Ukraine needs and Taiwan needs. And to me, I think it's unacceptable that there's a $19 billion backlog of arms that Taiwan has already paid for, that have been notified to Congress but haven't been delivered to Taiwan. And a lot of these are the asymmetric capabilities that the United States has been pushing Taiwan to purchase, from Stingers to Harpoons and Javelins. So, we need to do a lot more to expedite arms transfers to Taiwan. I think it needs to be a priority for the Department of Defense. Frankly, in some instances, Taiwan should leapfrog countries higher up in the queue, so to speak. But I think that we need to find also creative ways to get Taiwan the capabilities it needs through things like presidential drawdown authority, as well as foreign military financing.
There's a new conversation arising that's debating whether U.S. aid to Ukraine is good for Taiwan or not. On one hand, by helping out Ukraine, the U.S. is showing that it's willing to help a country under invasion. But on the other hand, the more the U.S. gives to Ukraine, the less there is for Taiwan. Where do you stand on that?
I think it's important for the United States to give this military support to Ukraine. And Taiwan's leaders believe that. Its representative in the United States, Bi Kim Xiao, has been very outspoken on this. And I think that Taiwan's elected officials have a pretty good understanding of what their interests are. And I would be very careful in questioning their assessments. Clearly, Taiwan views Ukraine repelling Russian aggression as important for Taiwan's security, as a deterrent signal to China. We've seen the same messaging out of Tokyo from Prime Minister Kishida. And so, I think that this is important. Had Russia, taken over Ukraine, essentially wiped it off the map, I think it would have sent a terrible signal to Xi Jinping that basically there will not be opposition if he does the same to Taiwan. So the issues that we've identified in terms of the defense industrial base, yes, those are urgent. They need to be addressed. But I think we can and should do that while providing military support to Ukraine.
Last question, and I'm going to leave this open-ended. Is there anything you think we should be looking out for?
For the United States, I think that the war in Ukraine, again, has revealed big gaps in our defense industrial base. We need to really address those. My view, again, is also that it's good that we discovered this now rather than during a Taiwan contingency. But now that we know what these gaps are, it's on us to repair them. My other thing that I would say, and I try to do this with some of my writings, is really to not assume that Americans understand what our strategic interests are in the Taiwan Strait, and that they, not assume that they understand, why Taiwan matters, to put it bluntly. And so I think that it is important to have a much bigger conversation in the United States. If this is something that the U.S. president might decide to send American men and women to die for, Americans have to understand why that decision could be made. And I think that we haven't even started having that conversation in the United States yet.
That was foreign relations expert David Sachs on why Taiwan is important to the U.S. And this has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus by following us on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.